So these are almost, I think all of these are pictures that I took. But anyway, these are from maybe last summer. But if you want to flip to the next one. Next slide. So I don't know how many of you remember, but President Obama in his administration had, through the Department of Transportation, started trying to plant pollinator corridors throughout the United States along highways. They said, why do we have this place that could be food for our pollinators, and instead of just letting grass grow or weeds, we ought to plant for them. So next slide. So this is what is one new area right near Calvert-Woodley that I'm hoping to work on soon. And if you go to the next slide, this is what it looked across the street from where I live. And you can see the trees. And if you had a close-up there, you would just see it's just mostly mulch or grass or nothing or stones. So we have we have a resource throughout the city, and there are tree boxes that haven't been planted. I know that many have been planted too, so I'm not pretending that's new. But in our neighborhood, there wasn't much planting up until about 5 years ago. Next slide, please. So pollinators are in decline. You probably know about that. And 3/4 of native plants, Kira, worldwide require pollination. All of us, not just Kira, but just because she's working on the native plants, I thought that was great. And they're always pollinated by an animal, often an insect, and almost always or often by a native bee. And native bees, I think it was between 2008 and 2013, had declined by 25%. So our pollinators are at risk. So they play, as you can see, a key role in maintaining our diverse ecosystem and supporting agriculture production. And believe it or not, 1 out of 3 bites we take are dependent on a pollinator. So if we want food in the future, it's on our onus to help make sure that they survive. And also that resource, the pollinators, are valued at $15 billion a year. Okay, next slide. So that's the why. The other good reason for doing this is there's a great ecologist, a guy named Doug Tallamy. He has TED Talks and he's written books. This is one of his older books, Nature's Best Hope. But he posed some cool questions, like when you look out your window, do you see anything move? Has your homeowner association passed rules that doesn't support wildlife? They don't want anything living coming around. And he also posed a question that said, we don't really have the right to starve these guys, to starve the pollinators. And the good news is we can fix this problem by indulging ourselves in planting native species through ecological restoration, which is really what a pollinator corridor is. Next slide. Obviously, the benefits of having a corridor is that when we plant native plants, and I'll talk a little bit more about keystone plants, but we will have pollinator services, so a place for bees and butterflies and so forth, all the pollinators to come and get their nectar and pass it along. Pest control, we have, instead of using pesticides, we can have native insects that can control different kinds of issues. Mosquitoes, for example, there's almost all the herbs and citronella can actually repel mosquitoes, so we don't need to spray mosquito DDT or whatever to get rid of them. Carbon sequestration for climate change, it's really important. Rainwater retention, our area is one of the areas that's going to be flooded with all of the changes from climate change. We're having more precipitation and heavier precipitation. We'll also have more bluebirds and goldfinches and butterflies, including monarchs. Next one. So we've had some really important partners that help us get this off the ground. Here is an ANC member who's actually helping in our planting. This was last fall, Claudette David. So we've worked with Van Ness Main Street is what those initials stand for, which is one of the main streets, and there's, I think, 26 of them around DC. The advisory neighborhood commissioners have been helpful too with a grant that then we neighbors helped raise money to match it. And that grant was for $5,000 last year for the spring planting of creating these pollinator corridors. And a lot of neighbors and even people from neighboring towns like Alexandria and Arlington came and even got for some of the high school kids, they got hours credits for their community service. Okay, next slide. We've had little kids as young as 3 years and 8 months. Quinn was helping out with his dad actually last year or this spring, and now you can see a few more pictures here of some of us working this year. So we're working in with native plants and putting in bulbs too. Here is the head of Calvert Woodley, one of the big stores in our neighborhood. And he is agreed to put in a pesticide-free zone sign, meaning they will not apply pesticides in the area that we're planting. So trying to get the business support on board has been one of the goals of the director of the Van Ness Main Street. So I think this is great that we've had a lot of success so far as we're continuing our work through this month. Next picture. We've also had the head of the Montessori school that's on Connecticut Avenue 2 be very supportive of this effort. Next slide. And our elected councilwoman, Che, who's been supportive even of the Master Gardening Program, as you probably heard, to get more slots. So it's really good to have her on board. She was on board to pass the laws in DC that have dealt with pesticide bans, but they really are only not on all public lands, and they're not on the federal land that's 1/3 of the land in DC, and not on private property. So we need to do a lot more, and she's very supportive of this effort, and we're trying to raise awareness about pesticides and also educate the public while we're planting something that most people will just see as beauty, but it's really with a purpose to deal with pollinators. Next slide. So Gucci was my spider that showed up in our garden last year, and she's a good garden spider. I think they call them black and yellow or green, or yellow and black, or anyway. But she's a very good spider, and it's good that we saw her, and I shared it with all the kids in the neighborhood and people of all ages, but people were excited to see, again, this little guy moving in the garden. Next slide. So the benefits of bees, you may already know all of this, but bees really need nectar March through October in our area. And if you have 2 to 3 weeks without blooms, it's really deadly to the bees. So we need to have a calendar, and I have a spreadsheet for people who are interested, of 12 months of what can be blooming around here, and again, focusing on native plants too. I will talk about keystone plants, but for the herbaceous plants, the key plants, not all natives are equal, but the key ones right now that we're focusing on are goldenrod, sunflowers, and asters. But it's interesting that a native willow can attract 69 different species of bees. So next slide, I think, is going to get into some more detail. So I said, be happy. It's on one of our sunflowers that was attracted an awful lot of goldfinches this summer too, up and down the corridor. Okay, I will be happy to email the list to folks. So the backbone to the local ecosystems are planting keystone plants. About 5% of all native plants are responsible for supporting 75% of wildlife. And so it's not just being diverse, and this is something that Doug Talamay stresses all the time. It's being very strategic. If you don't have a lot of place, if you don't have acres and acres and acres, you've got to be strategic. So from a tree perspective, the most important tree that supports like 536 times of caterpillars, moths, and butterflies are oaks, native oaks. Cherry trees, willows, birches, elms, cottonwoods, redbuds also are important too. And then the next important thing, as I mentioned, for the herbaceous plants are sunflowers, goldenrods, and asters. But and we all know we love the milkweed. The monarchs, and they definitely need milkweed, but they also need other plants with other nectar, because they're going to need, and they want not just one diet, they like other flowers around too. So having a lot of flowers with nectar that they appreciate is important too. All right, repetition, go ahead. Goldfinches in the garden. I don't know if you see that little bird in the middle there, but that's right on Connecticut Avenue, and he was, feeding here probably on some of the soldado, some of the goldenrod, and some of the coneflowers. Okay, next slide. Caterpillars are the best bird food, not worms. I know we've had that old thought, what early bird catches the worm, but the mainstay of birds' diets are actually caterpillars. There's an awful lot of them in the world, like 14,000 species of caterpillars. And if you were eating one caterpillar, you'd have to, if you couldn't find a caterpillar, a bird would have to feed its baby 200 aphids to get the value of protein out of one caterpillar. So that's a lot of work for a mother or father bird. They're highly nutritious, caterpillars are high in protein and fat, and they're very easy to feed the birds. If you've ever seen a mother bird or father bird feeding a baby, they shove their beaks down their baby's throat. So if you had a beetle or something that had sharp points, it would really be harmful. So if we want to save the birds, we also have to save all the butterflies as well. So we have caterpillars. Next slide. So again, I'm just going to show you some pictures. This is right on Connecticut Avenue, right near where I live. Again, these are sunflowers, a type of sunflower. Okay, Helianthus. Okay, next one. And there we have some phlox and a black swallowtail. And my stakes holding up the really tall plants that are starting to grow higher and higher. Kind of a nice little quiet place as you walk down the street now. With COVID, a lot of people have been very appreciative. Next picture. Of course, monarchs. We had monarchs last year and this year too. I think this one was one of them. I called one Leopold and one Rachel Carson. Next one. And if you do plant it, they will come. So here we've got some swamp milkweed, but I have regular milkweed, and it's also mixed in with other flowers like zinnias or marigolds or phlox. Okay, next one. So I don't know if you guys in your neighborhoods have streeteries, but because of COVID and having to eat outside, they've kind of taken space from the street.
Yeah.
Busy, too fast traveling cars. We are very happy to have the streetery. But they didn't have too much of a tree box, and I'll show you the one little place they had. So we got planters and planted, as you can see, plants all around the restaurant, which now is like a really cozy little place for these two restaurants. There's a French little bistro and then an Italian one with the funny name, I'm Americano. Say it fast, Americano, American, okay? Next slide. So this is the mighty oak tree that we said was really important as one of the keystone plants, but this very small tree box, but it still matters what we put in here. What's left of what we haven't developed is key and important for the pollinators and for our future and food system too. Next slide. And I was just showing this is a little plot near a bank right near there. That was the only other real soil that we could even, put in plants for without bringing in pots. Next one. And this little praying mantis, it's good luck to have him. He was outside of the Muchas Gracias restaurant near Politics and Prose while we were planting for like 3 hours. Everyone in the neighborhood who walked by, I showed this little guy. And we've seen them in the past years too. This was my first this year though. Next slide. Now this is my important list of the places for plants, but I also have a spreadsheet that I'm happy to share with Patricia that we can send around to anyone who's interested. I have stuff by perennials, native plants, shade, and then season bloom for the 12 months. But in addition, the National Wildlife Federation has a native plant finder. You can just, if you can't remember that, NFW, then native plants. You can put in your zip code and they'll give you a list and you can choose which ones to plant. Audubon has the same thing. They also have another site on their website for just plants for birds if you're interested. The resources that helped us create this and continue to support us, as I mentioned, with Van Ness Main Street, which is a main street, and there are, I think, 23 or 26 in DC. And they've been very supportive, and the businesses have also donated money to help pay for the plants and the soil and everything that we had to do. The Forest Hills Connection has been sort of like the social media. I've written a few articles I'm, again, happy to share. Just did one on leaves and mulch, but also on this pollinator corridor. And then I'll say our locally elected advisory neighborhood council members have been super supportive of this effort, and we're even talking more about trying to do more work with the pesticide-free area, maybe doing some voluntary effort for a couple years in our area to see if we can encourage. Obviously, we'd love to have it DC wide, but we may take baby steps initially to try to see if we can encourage through education others, people who are routinely spraying, including UDC. I'm afraid
Yeah.
stop spraying because it's just not needed and it's counterproductive to all the work that we do in the soil. So I think the next picture is just a thank you. The little yellow butterfly, that's it.